When my daughter slid a cashier's check for $33 million across my chipped kitchen table and said, "Mom, you were never meant to touch this kind of money," I realized she was not returning my fortune to save me. She was returning it to bury me with it. The kitchen around us felt colder than the winter night pressing against the windows. Tacoma evenings in December always carried that thick, damp chill, but this one seeped straight into my bones. The overhead light flickered with its usual tired buzz, casting a dull glow across the peeling laminate counters, the dented kettle, the troc sun edge of the table I had scrubbed for 20 years. I stood there with water still dripping from my hands because I had just finished washing dishes. My sleeves were rolled up, my hair frizzy from the steam, my breath catching in my throat as I looked at my only child sitting across from me like a stranger. Anna Hayes was 28, polished in a slate gray work suit, her designer bag perched neatly beside her chair, like it had higher social standing than I did. She did not look at the kitchen. She looked through it. Through me. You and numbers never mixed, Mom. Dad knew that. Brandon knows that. Just sign whatever they send next time. Do not try to understand it. Her voice was clipped, efficient the way she talked to medical assistants when she shadowed her husband at the clinic. She pushed the cashier's check a little closer with one manicured finger, as if I might be too slow to notice it. The check was crisp and heavy, almost gleaming in the yellow light. Made out to Marla J. Hayes. Memo return of primary proceeds. I blinked at it, my heart thudding with a mix of shock and something harder to name. That account had always been under my name. The Family Trust, Jacob's Trust. My late husband had built a medical supply business worth far more than I ever understood, because he never allowed me near the financials. When he passed 8 months ago, Anna and Brandon insisted everything needed to be transferred for processing. I believed them. I trusted them. Now that money was suddenly returned to me like a radioactive object, my stomach tightened. Anna leaned back, crossing her arms. "Do not go asking questions, okay? You cannot handle what Dad and Brandon were into. Keep it live quietly. Do not talk to anyone. You cannot handle." The words stung sharper than the cold. They were familiar. I had heard versions of them my entire marriage. I felt my breath catch again as Anna stood gathering her coat in one graceful motion. When she moved, her sleeve slipped just enough for me to see it, a faint bruise along her wrist. Purple thin, fresh. My entire chest tightened. I stepped forward without thinking. "Anna, what happened to your arm? Did Brandon do that?" Her eyes snapped to mine and hardened instantly. "This is not about me. It is about making sure they do not come for you. Be grateful I gave it back." She pulled her sleeve down with a sharp tug and looked away. My throat went dry. "Who is they?" She did not answer. She only adjusted her coat and gathered her bag. Her movements suddenly rushed brittle. It hit me all at once. My daughter was not here out of love or guilt. She was here because someone else wanted that money gone from her hands. Someone she feared more than the law. Someone Jacob might have known. Someone he might have owed. Anna paused by the door, her voice losing its polished calm for the first time. "Just lay low, Mom. Please." It was the please that terrified me. When the door closed behind her, the kitchen felt even smaller, even quieter. Snow tapped against the window. The check sat in the center of the table like a threat dressed up as a gift. I sank into the chair and stared at the name printed across the top. My name. My money. My risk. Then something inside me shifted. I opened the cabinet beneath the table and pulled out a thin stack of folders I had been hiding for years. Ward Analytics Licensing Agreements Confidential. I brushed dust from the top. Anna had no idea these existed. Neither did Brandon. Neither did Jacob. They all forgot who built the numbers they are laundering through. I whispered it to myself before I realized I had spoken aloud. My phone vibrated on the table. Unknown number. A single message. If you are holding Jacob's money, you are holding stolen lives. Get rid of it before we come collect. My heart slammed against my ribs. I lifted my eyes from the screen to the silent kitchen. The air felt different, heavier. That was when I understood the truth. The $33 million was not just an inheritance. It was bait, and I had just been pushed into the center of a hunt I never asked for. If you have ever been treated like you are too stupid for money, tell me where you are listening from. I sat alone at the same chipped kitchen table, where the cashier's check had rested only minutes earlier. The silence of the house pressing against my ears as if it were trying to warn me that the world I thought I understood had already shifted beneath my feet, and the faint hum of the refrigerator mixed with the soft patter of the winter rain outside, creating a rhythm that made the $33 million in front of me feel even more absurd, almost theatrical yet painfully real in its threat. My fingers hovered above the check, tracing the embossed numbers the way someone might touch a wound to confirm it is truly there, and for the first time in years I found myself replaying the little humiliations that had been fed to me, one careful spoonful at a time, conditioning me to believe I was lucky to be included in my own life. "You are lucky Dad ever trusted you with a debit card," Anna had said one afternoon while we stood in the parking lot outside Brandon's clinic, her voice light and airy, as if she were pointing out a sale instead of insulting me in front of two nurses who exchanged glances and then politely stared at the pavement. "The only reason your name is on anything is taxes." "Mom," she had added a week later, shrugging like it was a fact of nature, like gravity, like rain, like something I should not challenge if I wanted to be seen as agreeable. Those words returned to me now with painful clarity weaving themselves into the steam rising from my mug of tea, and I felt a familiar tightening in my chest, that quiet ache women my age know too well, the ache that comes from being spoken to like a burden, like someone who cannot be trusted with her own judgment, someone who must always defer to the younger, more confident generations who believe worldliness is measured not in kindness or wisdom, but in who can say things with the sharpest tone. Ever since Jacob died, Anna and Brandon had stepped in to manage everything as if I were a guest in my own affairs, not out of generosity, but out of certainty that I was incapable of navigating anything beyond grocery lists and church calendars. Each bill, each document, each decision flowed through their hands first, and they decided how much information I could handle, usually very little. They transferred my grocery money every Monday, $150, exactly, no more, no less, as if regulating my spending were a charitable act that should earn them applause. When Brandon explained that this system was for my own protection, he had said it loudly in front of a cashier at the hardware store, announcing that my card had been disabled because of the risk of scammers targeting older women. The woman behind the counter had looked at me with a mixture of pity and polite discomfort, while Brandon smiled confidently, and I had nodded weakly, pretending the ground beneath us had not abruptly vanished. The truth was that every small humiliation had chipped away at me until I no longer recognized the woman reflected in the dark window above the sink, a woman who used to analyze data for a living and once trusted her own instincts without permission. Now I felt myself shrinking into the outline of a person. Brandon and Anna preferred me to be someone who kept quiet, someone who did not understand money, someone who would not ask too many questions. But the message on my phone, the bruise on Anna's wrist, the $33 million on my table, all of it made something inside me shift again, an awakening that felt both terrifying and strangely steady. I reached for my laptop, the old one missing 2 keys, but still functional enough for the things they deemed safe for me to access. Brandon had installed parental controls on it, though he had not used that term instead, saying he simplified it to make things easier for me. My hands trembled slightly as I opened my online banking page, fully expecting the usual blocked interface that prevented me from viewing anything beyond the tiny grocery account they monitored. Instead, after a brief loading spin, a different account name appeared in the corner, one I had not seen in years, one that made my breath catch in my throat. Marla Ward Savings. My maiden name, a part of myself I had tucked away so deeply I had almost forgotten it was once printed on envelopes on school forms on the badge, clipped to my blouse during my years at the hospital. The account had been closed, I thought, or at least frozen when Jacob moved all our financials into the family trust. Yet here it was, quietly alive untouched, holding far more than a forgotten balance. When I clicked on it, a long list of deposits greeted me, steady and consistent over 12 years, enough to make my pulse race enough to confirm a truth I had pushed aside because it did not fit the story my family rewrote for me. I was not helpless. I was not poor. I was not uninvolved. A part of my past that I had hidden out of convenience or exhaustion had been working for me all along, quietly securing pieces of independence that no one in my current life knew existed. I sat back in my chair, staring at the numbers, feeling a warmth in my chest that I had not felt in years, a mix of vindication and grief, and something that almost resembled hope. I printed the most recent statements, listening to the old printer groan its way through each page. Then I folded the papers neatly and slipped them inside a plastic bread bag in the back of the refrigerator behind a container of leftover soup. It was a hiding place so ordinary, so domestic, that no one would ever think to look there, least of all the people who believed I needed protection from online scammers. I closed the fridge and stood there for a moment, my hand still resting on the handle, letting the weight of the discovery settle into me. For the first time in a long time, I felt the faint outline of the woman I used to be. The woman they had forgotten I was the woman who was beginning to remember herself. The quiet weight of the printed statements in the refrigerator lingered in my mind as I stood in the dim kitchen, and something about the stillness of that night, the hum of the old appliances, and the faint memory of my daughter's cold voice pushed me back into a part of my life. I had almost trained myself to forget a life that existed long before anyone tried to shrink me down into something small and harmless. 15 or 20 years earlier, I was not the woman who needed reminders about online banking or weekly grocery transfers. I was the woman people at the hospital called when numbers did not make sense, when claims did not align with medical records, when patterns hid something that should not be hidden, and I wore my badge with quiet pride, not because of the title, but because I knew how to see what others missed. I remembered sitting in a fluorescent-lit office with charts taped to the walls and a spreadsheet glowing on my screen, realizing that a series of duplicate billing entries across multiple departments followed the same timing rhythm, a rhythm too precise to be random, and I had traced it back to a single vendor whose invoices never matched their shipment logs, and that discovery had saved the system millions yet. When I went home that evening, expecting to feel seen, Jacob had looked at me with that familiar half-smile, the one that felt like a pat on the head disguised as affection, and said, "Hospitals do not need you, they need me. You are playing with spreadsheets. I am making real deals." At the time, I had swallowed the sting of it, telling myself it was just his way of feeling important, that not every man knows how to handle a wife who sees numbers faster than he can read them. But his words planted seeds that sprouted into vines over the years, wrapping around my confidence until I stopped talking about my work altogether. Yet during that period, in the quiet hours after dinner, when Jacob was on calls and Anna was doing homework, I had been building something that came from the part of me no one could dim, a simple analytic model. At first, just a code that flagged payment, irregularities based on timing volume and cross-referencing vendor histories. But it grew into something larger, something sharper, and soon it became a functioning prototype that could recognize unusual billing activity across entire hospital networks. I had called it Ward Analytics, using my maiden name because deep down I sensed that one day I might need to claim it without interference. And I remembered the tremor of excitement when a small health tech startup reached out after hearing whispers about my tool, claiming they were interested in acquiring licensing rights. I'd signed the contract quietly, storing the paperwork in the same cabinet that now held the old folders I pulled out earlier. telling Jacob only that a colleague was helping me evaluate a side project, and he had not asked further because in his mind, anything I worked on was harmless, unthreatening background noise. But the startup did not remain small. Within 3 years, it expanded aggressively, caught the attention of a major corporation, and then was purchased for a sum that made the employees wealthy and left me with a modest but steady share of dividends as part of the licensing agreement. I watched those dividends grow annually, never drawing attention to them, never mentioning them to Jacob or Anna, because I had learned by then that the things you protect are the things you do not announce. I opened my old email archives, now scrolling past years of forgotten messages, until I found one from the CEO, a woman named Caroline, whose confidence had always inspired me, and her words stared back at me with a force I had not felt in ages. If you ever see your model abused for fraud, call me. We will protect you. The moment I read it, a shiver ran across my skin because it connected too neatly with the bruise on Anna's wrist, the cashier's check on my kitchen table, and the anonymous message threatening that Jacob's money was tied to stolen lives. It made the air feel heavy again, but not with helplessness, rather, with the slow rising awareness that I had tools my family never considered I could possibly wield, because they had convinced themselves that my world ended at grocery lists and laundry cycles. I stood there breathing slowly, letting the recognition settle in, understanding for the first time in years that I was not a background character in my own life, that I had once been someone who could see through the fog of complicated data and find truth in the smallest inconsistencies, and that woman had not disappeared. She'd only been ignored into silence. With my heart beating steadily now, I turned to my laptop again and hovered over the login page for Ward Analytics, the system I had built, refined and signed away, but never truly lost, and my fingers trembled slightly as I typed in the old username I had not said aloud in years. For a moment, I hesitated, listening to the quiet pulse of the house, feeling the old version of myself stir beneath the surface, like an animal waking in the dark, and then I pressed the final key. The screen blinked once, then again, and I held my breath as I waited to see whether they had erased me the way my family tried to, or whether the woman they forgot I was still had a place in the system she created. The login wheel spun long enough for doubt to slip in, curling around my ribs, as I waited for the system to reject me, the way my family had learned to, but then the screen clicked into place, and the familiar dashboard of Ward Analytics unfolded in front of me, older in its layout than I remembered, yet unmistakably mine. The soft blue interface carrying the same patterns I had once stayed up late perfecting, and for a moment I simply stared, letting the shock settle across my skin like a cold cloth, because accessing this space again felt like stepping into a room I had locked years ago and forgotten how to enter. The dashboard loaded recent activity, automatically generating a summary page of monitored accounts. And though I had not touched this system in over a decade, a series of red and yellow markers pulsed across the map, like points of heat on thermal imaging, signaling areas where billing patterns fell outside acceptable thresholds. And as I clicked on the most recent chain of alerts, my throat tightened. The first cluster centered around a group of outpatient clinics in Pierce and King County, places I recognized from my old work. But the numbers were what stopped me. A sudden spike in orthopedic device claims, unusually high volumes within small windows of time. Identical procedural codes repeated with mechanical precision, and vendor shipments logged through a supplier chain that should have triggered audits months earlier. When I expanded the vendor details, the name appeared Everpoint Medical Supply, printed in brisk corporate font, and my stomach clenched, because I had seen that name before. Not on screens from my past life, but in Jacob's files buried in the stack I had pulled from the cabinet when Anna left earlier, the vendor he claimed provided discounted equipment for growing clinics across the state. I felt my hand drift toward the edge of the table, steadying myself, as my eyes scanned the columns again, confirming what instinct already told me, that whatever was happening here was no coincidence, and that Jacob had been connected to something far more complex than sales calls and distribution deals. I clicked further into the report, opening the tab that displayed provider involvement, and as the list populated, my breath hitched, because there it was. Lot Ortho Group, the company Brandon worked for, appearing again and again in sequences of flagged transactions, each one marked with a small red tag indicating high-risk partner of interest under quiet review, a phrase that landed in my chest with both familiarity and dread, because it meant the system had identified these activities as part of a potential network-wide pattern, something that could trigger state or federal investigation if enough supporting data was collected. It felt surreal to watch my own program outline the possible misconduct of my husband's associates and my son-in-law's employer surreal and devastating, because the deeper I looked, the clearer it became that the model I built to expose fraud might have been exploited by the very people who spent years telling me I did not understand numbers that I was not equipped to handle, finances that I should leave the complicated thinking to them. My hands trembled as I clicked through timeline graphs, each one a rising and falling wave of procedural codes and reimbursement rates, and for a fleeting moment a sharp ache spread behind my ribs, a mix of betrayal and self-recognition, as if the past version of me stood beside the present one, whispering, "You knew how to see this long before they convinced you otherwise." The pain swelled, slowly rising like water in a basin, because seeing evidence that Jacob might have used my work, my algorithms, my insight not only for his business, but possibly for something unlawful, made the air feel heavy and strange, and the realization that Brandon's clinic appeared in these patterns too made the bruise on Anna's wrist echo louder in my mind. I forced myself to focus, pulling up the export option, selecting the full summary and underlying data, and when the download finished, I printed the reports on the old machine in the corner of the kitchen, listening to it whir and clatter as page after page slid out, each one filled with numbers that painted a truth my family tried to blind me from. When the last sheet emerged, I gathered them quickly and slipped them into an empty cereal box, pressing the flaps closed, then tucked the box behind a row of other pantry items because I knew instinctively that what I had just found was far too dangerous to leave in the open. I returned to my laptop intending to log out, but a new notification flashed across the screen, an automated message from the compliance branch of the platform's new corporate owners, and my pulse spiked as I read it. "We have noticed unusual access from your account, Ms. Ward. If this is not you, reply immediately. Compliance team." I stared at those words, feeling a flicker of fear mingle with something sharper, because the message confirmed that the system was not dormant, it was still monitored by higher-level teams, possibly even shared with regulatory partners, and my access had stirred attention I had not expected. The room seemed to tighten around me, the shadows deepening with the weight of what this all implied, and as I closed the laptop gently, my heartbeat thundered with a clarity I had not felt in years, a clarity telling me that I was no longer simply dealing with family condescension or disrespect. I was standing at the edge of a truth large enough to swallow reputations, careers, and lives, and the only question left was whether I would step back or finally step forward into the woman they forgot I was. The cereal box with the hidden report sat in my pantry like a silent witness as I dressed for dinner the following evening, my hands steady, even though my thoughts churned beneath the surface, and by the time I drove from Tacoma to Seattle, weaving through the cold evening traffic, I felt the old version of myself settling more firmly into my bones, the version who once walked hospital corridors with purpose, the version no one at that dinner table would recognize. Brandon and Anna lived in a polished neighborhood lined with trimmed hedges and quiet sidewalks, the kind of place where houses glowed with curated warmth, and every surface looked like it had been chosen to photograph well. And as I stepped into their foyer, the scent of roasted garlic and something citrusy filled the air, masking the tension that greeted me before anyone even spoke. Anna gave me a thin smile, the kind that apologized without meaning it, and behind her, Brandon stood straight-backed in a crisp shirt, his expression carefully arranged into concern that never reached his eyes. His parents were already seated at the long dining table, both dressed as if attending a fundraiser rather than a family meal, and as I took my seat beside them, I felt their eyes sweep over me with the same assessing glance someone might give a donation item at a charity drive. The conversation started politely enough comments about traffic and weather, but it took exactly 3 minutes before the tone shifted into the familiar rhythm of condescension disguised as small talk, and the first blow came from Brandon's mother, who lifted her wine glass and said with a tinkling laugh, "So you are still figuring out how online banking works, dear." I smiled softly, pretending the words did not cut. Pretending I had not spent the previous night uncovering schemes more complex than anything they would ever understand, and before I could respond, Brandon's father chimed in. "Good thing you never had to handle Jacob's deals. You would have donated it all to cats." The table laughed as though they had delivered a clever punchline, and I kept my gaze on my plate, letting their voices wash over me, letting their certainty about who I was reveal itself more plainly than they realized. Anna watched me closely, her expression tightening every time a comment landed, but she said nothing, perhaps still carrying whatever fear made her shove the cashier's check toward me the night before, and the silence between us stretched like a thread pulled taut. Brandon cleared his throat after the salad plates were removed, leaning forward with that patient posture doctors often use when explaining bad news to patients. And he said slowly, "Mom, we need to talk about the check. You are holding IRS rules are complicated, and we really think it would be better if you moved the money into a family-managed investment fund that I can oversee so you are protected." I nodded slightly, pretending the idea was new to me, even though the calculated phrasing mirrored the tactics I had seen in countless fraud cases years ago. And he continued with the same measured tone, saying things like, "You do not want to make a mistake, and this is for your safety. And I can make sure it is handled properly," all while the rest of the table nodded approvingly, as though he were offering shelter to a lost child rather than attempting to gain control over a fortune. I glanced at Anna, then searching for any signal in her eyes, any echo of the panic she had shown the previous night, but she looked away, her lips pressed tightly together as though she had already surrendered to whatever plan Brandon had laid out. The conversation drifted after that, touching on news stories and vacation plans, yet beneath it all ran an undercurrent that tightened the air, and as I reached for my water glass, I heard a soft voice barely above a whisper coming from Brandon's father, who leaned toward his wife and said once the POA is signed, we can move her into memory care and no one will question where the funds went. The words slid into my ears like ice water, chilling me from the inside out, and I kept my face neutral even as my pulse kicked sharply, understanding suddenly and completely that their plan was not just about accessing the money, it was about erasing my legal autonomy entirely, placing me into a facility under the guise of cognitive decline so they could take what they wanted without interference. I breathed in, slowly tasting the metallic edge of fear, but also something steadier beneath it, a rising determination that surprised even me, and I let my shoulders slump slightly, offering them the picture of confusion they expected. Then I turned to Brandon with a small, hesitant smile and said in a soft voice, "I think I just want to feel comfortable before I sign anything. Could I take a copy of the POA home so I can read it for peace of mind?" Brandon exchanged a quick look with his parents, their confidence flickering for only a moment before he reached into his briefcase and pulled out a neatly bound document, sliding it across the table toward me with a smile that suggested he believed he had already won. I picked it up carefully, nodding as though reassured, though my mind had already moved 3 steps ahead, already envisioning how the pages would look once photographed already, imagining how to send them to the private email I had kept hidden for years, the one attached to the work I had never spoken of. When the meal ended and I stepped out into the cool Seattle night, The city lights shimmered across the street, and the air smelled faintly of rain, and with the document tucked securely inside my bag, I walked to my car, feeling the quiet thrum of purpose growing stronger in my chest, knowing that every word I had heard tonight would serve me soon, not as a wound, but as a weapon. The night after the dinner in Seattle, I barely slept, not because of fear, but because the threads that had been pulling at me for days finally began to form a pattern clear enough to follow. And by morning, I knew exactly who I needed to speak to, the one person from my past who understood the language of numbers and deception, the way I did someone who had seen the value of my work long before my own family tried to convince me it was nothing more than a hobby. Caroline Price had once been a junior compliance officer at a regional insurance network, bright-eyed and nervous, terrified that an audit would reveal the catastrophic gaps in her department's oversight gaps that threatened millions in penalties and the careers of everyone involved. Yet when Ward Analytics flagged the fraudulent activity that no one else could see and helped them intercept a billing scheme before it exploded into a formal federal investigation, she had looked at me as though I had lifted a boulder from her chest, and she sent me an email that day promising that if I ever needed anything, she would be there. I had not spoken to her in years, not because of distance, but because I had let Jacob convince me that old colleagues had no place in the life he wanted us to build, and so I pulled up her old message on my phone, now the familiar signature glinting faintly on the cracked screen, and typed a short note asking if she had time to meet somewhere discreet. Her response came in under 10 minutes, a simple yes, with a location I knew well, a small cafe tucked behind Tacoma Mall, where the hum of conversations always blended into the background enough to shield private discussions. I drove there with the cereal box of printed reports on the passenger seat, my fingers brushing its cardboard edges every so often as if confirming it was still there. And by the time I stepped into the warmth of the cafe, the tension buzzing in my limbs had shifted into something sharper, something close to purpose. Caroline sat near the back window, her hair a little shorter, her posture straighter, and when she saw me, her eyes softened with recognition that carried a hint of guilt for letting so many years pass. We exchanged the usual niceties, but the moment we sat down, I slid the stack of documents from the box, laying them flat between us with the same care someone might use when placing evidence on a courtroom table. She scanned the papers quickly, flipping through the charts and reports, with the efficient motion of someone trained to detect anomalies at a glance. And as she reached the pages detailing Everpoint Medical Supply and the repeated appearance of Lot Ortho Group, her expression tightened, her jaw clenching slightly. After a long moment, she pushed the papers aside and leaned in, lowering her voice so only I could hear her, and said, "Marla, CMS and OIG have been watching these patterns for 2 years. We have a partial map of the network, but nothing solid enough to make a formal case, because we do not have anyone who can get close to the people actually pulling the strings." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle, then added quietly, "But you do." I felt the air shift around us, the cafe noise fading into the background as her statement rooted itself inside me. And for a moment, I simply stared at her, absorbing the implication that I had become the missing piece in a puzzle far larger than the humiliation I had endured at my own dining tables, far larger than the disrespect of being told I could not handle finances larger even than the $33 million used as leverage to keep me silent. My breath trembled slightly as I asked what that meant, and she answered in that calm, measured tone I remembered from her early days in compliance, the one she used when delivering news that could alter someone's life, explaining that what I had uncovered was not just suspicious activity, but a potential multi-provider scheme, possibly involving equipment, kickbacks, fraudulent medical coding, and vendor manipulation, and that the presence of Lot Ortho Group tied into ongoing federal suspicion, though they had never had direct access to anyone involved with the clinicians or administrators behind it. She tapped her finger gently on the page where the clinic's name appeared repeatedly and said, You are in their family circle, and that makes you the one person who can get close enough to help us confirm the internal trail, because without a witness or supporting evidence from someone they trust, any full-scale investigation stalls before it begins. For a moment, the reality of her words pressed into me heavy with the knowledge that I was no longer navigating a private injustice, but something that could alter the course of a federal inquiry, something with consequences that rippled outward far beyond my kitchen walls. And yet beneath the fear, there was a strange rising steadiness, a sense that the woman they thought had nothing left to offer suddenly held more power than any of them could imagine. Caroline must have seen the mixture of shock and resolve crossing my face, because she reached for my hand lightly and said, "We will protect you, Marla, but you need to play this exactly right." We sat there for nearly an hour mapping out a plan that balanced risk with necessity, and she told me that my greatest advantage was the same one my family had used to discredit me for years: their belief that I was harmless, unaware, easily persuaded. She said if I continued to act confused and compliant, they would reveal more than they intended, and in the meantime, I could pass every piece of evidence directly to her team, quiet transmissions that would slowly build the case. I listened, feeling the old wounds of being underestimated shift into something like armor, something I could now use instead of merely endure. And when we stood to leave, Caroline squeezed my shoulder and said, "Let them underestimate you one more time, Marla, just one more time." I walked back to my car with the winter air brushing against my cheeks, feeling the weight of years spent being dismissed, turning into a sharp and deliberate focus. And as I sat behind the wheel, I whispered to myself with a calm I had not felt in decades, "I will let them underestimate me one more time, and then I will make sure they never do again." The morning after meeting Caroline, I woke with a steadiness that felt unfamiliar, yet deeply anchored, as if the pieces of myself I had allowed to erode over the years had finally begun to settle back into place, forming a foundation strong enough to hold what was coming. I moved through the house with quiet purpose, tidying the kitchen, folding a blanket over the back of the couch, placing the cereal box, with its hidden reports, deeper behind canned goods, all the while rehearsing the mask I needed to wear the soft, bewildered expression they expected from me, the slightly hesitant tone, the way my hands would tremble just enough to reassure them that I was still the woman they believed they could guide like a child. It was in this calm that I heard the knock on the door firm and practiced, and when I opened it, Brandon stood on my porch with an expression that feigned concern, but carried an undercurrent cold enough to raise the hairs on my arms. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, brushing a fleck of imaginary dust from his jacket sleeve, and said, in a voice structured to sound sympathetic, "Anna is anxious, and you holding that check makes everyone nervous. We need you to do the right thing, Marla." I nodded slowly, letting my gaze fall to the floor in a gesture of uncertainty, and he continued speaking with that steady, rehearsed cadence that doctors use when they expect obedience from their patients, reminding me again that managing $33 million was complicated, that IRS scrutiny was harsh, that these decisions required someone who understood the financial landscape, someone like him. He took a seat at the kitchen table, the same table where Anna had placed the check 2 nights earlier, and opened his sleek leather folder, sliding out the power of attorney documents that I had photographed but pretended not to comprehend. His tone softened into something almost paternal as he said, "If you sign now, I can help you manage the assets and make sure everything stays protected and stress-free." And he smiled in that thin way that never reached his eyes, a smile that expected gratitude. I let my shoulders slump and pressed a hand against my chest as though steadying myself, then said in a small, quiet voice, "I'm just scared of messing things up." "Brandon, maybe you are right. Maybe you should handle this because I do not want to do anything wrong." The relief in his posture was immediate, his spine relaxing, his confidence returning like a tide, and he leaned forward to explain the next steps with the ease of someone certain. Victory was only minutes away. While he spoke gesturing toward the signature lines, I listened with half an ear, the other half focused on the small device in my sweater pocket, a cheap recorder app running on an old phone I kept for emergencies. I waited until he excused himself to use the restroom, a habit he always had after drinking too much coffee at the clinic, and the moment the bathroom door clicked shut, I moved quickly, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and resolve as I set the phone beneath a stack of napkins on the table, angling its microphone toward his chair, then slid the entire stack into an empty tissue box so the sound would travel unobstructed. It was a trick so ordinary, so domestic that anyone else might overlook it, and I felt a spark of pride that such a simple object could become my entry into the world they believed I had no right to navigate. When Brandon returned, he continued talking freely, unaware that every word spilled into the quiet microphone, unaware that the careful facade he wore in public had slipped just enough to reveal the truth beneath it. He spoke about adjusting billing codes to optimize revenue, a phrase that sounded harmless to untrained ears, but carried a clear undertone of manipulation to anyone who understood medical claims. And when he mentioned moving equipment invoices through vendors who cooperative teams turn a blind eye to, I felt heat rise beneath my skin as the implications sharpened. He even laughed lightly when he referenced shifting money between accounts until audits lose the trail. A sound that struck me as both careless and cruel, because it echoed so clearly the condescension he had shown me for years, only now wrapped in language that confirmed everything Ward Analytics had flagged. As he talked, unaware of how deeply he was incriminating himself, I nodded dutifully, murmuring agreement in spots where he expected reassurance, and by the time he finished outlining the steps he wanted me to follow, the recorder had captured enough evidence to stitch together the shape of a crime far larger than the role he expected me to play. When he finally closed his folder, he placed a pen beside the power of attorney packet and said, "All you need to do is sign right here, and then you can relax because everything will be taken care of." And I looked at him with what I knew he would interpret as gratitude, letting silence stretch. Just long enough to build his confidence before whispering softly, "Could I think it over for just one more night? I promise I will not take long." He hesitated, irritation flickering briefly in his eyes, then smoothed his expression and nodded, telling me he would come by again tomorrow, reminding me not to speak to anyone about the check until everything was finalized. After he left, I locked the door behind him, leaning against it for a moment as the tension eased from my shoulders, and then I walked back to the kitchen, retrieved the phone from inside the tissue box, and pressed play, listening to his voice fill the room with every damning phrase. The sound of it did not frighten me. It steadied me, because for the first time in years I had more than instinct or suspicion, I had proof. And as I saved the file under a coded name and tucked the device into the pantry beside the cereal box, I felt the quiet triumph of a woman who had spent years being underestimated and was finally learning how to turn that underestimation into her greatest weapon. I drove into Seattle the next morning with the small recorder in my coat pocket and a guarded steadiness guiding every mile, the kind of steadiness that comes when you finally stop pretending that everything will fix itself and accept that you must be the one to pull the first thread. The city was wrapped in a low gray haze traffic, humming along I-5 like a restless tide, and by the time I pulled into the underground lot beneath the glass building, Caroline had texted me about, my palms were damp not from fear exactly, but from the weight of stepping into a world I once knew professionally, yet never imagined confronting again under circumstances like these. Caroline met me in the lobby, her blazer sharp and her expression tight with urgency, and she led me through a series of hallways until we reached a conference room where two investigators from OIG and CMS waited, their posture upright, their eyes sharp, their notebooks already open, as though they had been preparing for this meeting long before I knew it existed. I sat down across from them and placed the recorder gently in the center of the table, pressing play. and Brandon's voice filled the room with its smooth, calculated ease, every phrase about adjusting billing and shifting money sounding even more incriminating in the sterile quiet of a federal office. And as the investigators listened, their pens moved quickly, their glances at one another growing more pointed. When the recording ended, one of them reached for the printed reports I had brought, the ward analytics summaries, and the Everpoint vendor chain documents, flipping through them with the kind of practiced familiarity that only comes from spending years dissecting fraud cases, and for several minutes the only sounds in the room were pages turning and the faint hum of the ceiling vent. Then the lead investigator looked up, her expression, not shocked but sharpened, calibrated like someone whose suspicions had just been confirmed in full. She tapped one finger on the printout and said, "We have been building a case against Lot Ortho and their suppliers for months, and this recording, combined with your documents, changes everything because with your testimony, this stops being a basic fraud case and becomes a conspiracy case." And the word conspiracy settled over the room with a heaviness that made my breath catch as the full meaning hit me. It meant Brandon had not just manipulated billing codes or nudged numbers. He had worked in concert with vendors and possibly other clinics, forming a network that exploited the system at a scale far beyond what I had allowed myself to imagine, and a chill of fear slid across my skin because the man who had spent years mocking my intelligence had been building something dangerous enough to require federal intervention. Yet beneath the fear, there was something else. Something sharp and quietly satisfying, a sense of vindication that came from realizing that the very patterns I had designed to detect wrongdoing had finally circled back to expose the people who believed I would never understand them. I listened as the investigators explained the next steps, outlining the subpoenas they planned to issue, the warrants they expected to secure, the quiet surveillance they had already begun on Everpoint shipments. And the more they spoke, the clearer it became that this machine had been turning long before I walked into the room, but my involvement was the keystone they needed to push it from suspicion into action. When they finished the lead, investigator leaned back slightly and studied me with a calm intensity and said, "He is hosting a charity gala next month. Is that correct?" And I nodded, remembering the embossed invitations Anna had left on the counter, as though I had been included out of love rather than obligation. The investigator continued speaking in an even measured tone, saying, "We would like you to attend and let him think the power of attorney is working, because the more comfortable he feels, the more careless he will be, and it will give us the opening to execute the public phase of the investigation with maximum clarity and minimum confusion." The idea of walking into Brandon's gala pretending to be the same meek, easily guided woman they thought I was sent a flicker of unease through me, but it was quickly overtaken by something stronger, a rising certainty that I was finally done shrinking myself to fit the space they allowed me. For years, I had let them decide who I was, the woman who needed help with online banking, the woman who should not ask questions, the woman too fragile to handle money or information or truth. And now the investigators were asking me to step into a role that required no facade of fragility, because the truth itself had become my strength. I felt the shift happen inside me like a quiet click, a moment of alignment in which fear and determination fused into purpose. And for the first time since Jacob's death, I felt completely awake. I nodded slowly and said, "Yes, I will go, and I will make sure he has no idea what is coming." And one of the investigators smiled with a kind of respectful acknowledgement, as if recognizing the emergence of a woman who had stopped accepting the smallness others assigned to her. As I left the office, Caroline walked me back to the elevator and paused before the doors opened, and she said in a low, steady voice, "Whatever happens next, you are not the woman they think you are, and you never were." And I felt her words land deep inside my chest, solid and steady. And driving home through the late afternoon traffic, I kept replaying the meeting in my mind, the recording echoing faintly in my memory, the investigators calm and certain, and with every passing mile I felt the old skin of timidity shedding away, because the truth I had tried to smother for years was finally rising to the surface, and the thought that carried me across the Narrows Bridge was simple and powerful. I am done playing small, and they are not ready for who I am becoming. The night of the gala arrived wrapped in the kind of winter chill that felt almost ceremonial, as if the air itself understood that something long buried was about to be dragged into the light. And as I stepped out of the rideshare in front of the Hyatt Regency, with its glass facade glittering against the Seattle skyline, I felt a stillness settle in my chest, not the stillness of fear, but the stillness of a woman who has finally stopped apologizing for seeing things clearly. Inside the ballroom glowed with warm, amber lighting strings of lights suspended from the ceiling, like constellations waiters weaving between tables, with trays of champagne flutes that caught and scattered the glow, and the sound of soft orchestral music drifted beneath the hum of conversation as doctors, investors, and wealthy donors gathered in tight clusters, their laughter floating upward like bubbles that would pop the moment truth pierced the room. I spotted Anna first standing near the entrance in a pale blue gown that made her look fragile in a way that tugged at me. Despite everything, but beside her was Brandon in a tailored tuxedo with a confidence so inflated it seemed to push the air around him. And when they both saw me approach, Anna gave a small smile that failed to meet her eyes, while Brandon's expression flickered with surprise before smoothing into the polite condescension he always reserved for me in public settings. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice as if fearing my incompetence might embarrass him, and said, "I'm glad you made it, Marla. This is a big night, and it will go even more smoothly once you sign those papers." Then he tapped the inside pocket of his jacket, where the power of attorney documents lay as though they were simply waiting for my inevitable surrender. Anna stood close beside him, nodding with the timid obedience she often wore when his mood hovered between charm and pressure. And before I could respond, one of Brandon's colleagues approached, clapping him on the shoulder and saying loudly enough for half the room to hear, "This must be your mother-in-law. She does not really understand what is going on, but hey, she looks like she enjoys free champagne." Laughter rippled through the small group, light and careless, and though Anna winced slightly, Brandon chuckled as if it were nothing more than harmless teasing, repeating the joke for emphasis, while I simply lifted my chin and let their underestimation wrap around me like armor. The evening unfolded with Brandon moving from table to table, boasting about his new initiative to revolutionize cost-effective orthopedic care for underserved communities, and each time he passed me, he whispered a reminder about signing the papers tonight so we can move the assets cleanly and you can relax for the first time in your life. And I nodded with the same soft uncertainty he expected, letting him believe he was inches from victory. As the orchestra transitioned into a softer melody, the event director approached the stage to announce that Dr. Brandon Lott would soon present his new charitable foundation, inviting the audience to take their seats, and the room settled into an attentive hush as he moved toward the steps with the easy stride of a man convinced that the room belonged to him. I stood near the edge of the crowd, the investigators strategically positioned in different corners of the ballroom, disguised as donors, and as Brandon adjusted the microphone on the podium, I felt a pulse of electricity beneath my ribs, the feeling of a trap, tightening around a predator, who never realized the prey was watching him set his own snare. He began with a speech polished enough to have been rehearsed for weeks, speaking about integrity, community trust, and the future of patient care. And just as he reached the part about transparency in medical practices, I stepped forward, lifting my hand in a quiet but unmistakable request for the microphone, and the room turned toward me with a mixture of curiosity and confusion. Brandon froze, his smile tightening, and whispered, "What are you doing?" But I did not look at him, instead, addressing the audience in a clear, steady voice that sliced through the glittering room like a needle through silk. Before you donate $1 to this man's charity, you should know exactly how many fake surgeries he billed for." And a ripple of shock swept across the tables as cameras lifted instinctively, lenses widening in unison. I continued speaking, reading from the numbers burned into my mind, describing inflated claims, unnecessary equipment orders, and vendor ties to Everpoint Medical Supply. Each word turning the room colder as murmurs rose like a rising tide. Flashes burst from every direction as journalists who had attended for a charity piece suddenly realized they were witnessing something far more electric, and Brandon tried to laugh it off, reaching for my arm to usher me away. But before he could touch me, one of the investigators stepped forward. Badge lifted discreetly at first, then openly as she moved toward the stage. The lead investigator mounted the stairs with calm authority and announced that an arrest warrant had been issued for Dr. Brandon Lott for conspiracy to commit medical fraud and related offenses, her voice carrying effortlessly through the speakers, still connected to the microphone, and the room erupted into gasps and frantic whispers as Brandon's face drained of color. His parents stood up from their table in stunned horror. Anna pressed a trembling hand to her mouth, and the entire ballroom seemed to tilt slightly as the polished mask he had worn for years cracked in full public view. The investigators escorted him off the stage while flashes continued to burst around us. Journalists shouting questions, donors stepping back as though fraud could be contagious, and I remained standing in the glow of the stage lights, feeling the strange, fierce calm of a woman who had been dismissed for most of her life and had finally chosen the perfect moment to show exactly how wrong they had been. It was not triumph in the loud, vengeful way some might imagine, but something deeper, steadier. The quiet satisfaction of reclaiming a voice that had been underestimated for far too long, and as the ballroom churned with chaos, I felt only one clear thought rise inside me. I warned them with silence, and now I am warning them with truth. The house was unusually quiet the morning after the gala, the kind of stillness that follows a storm when debris has settled. But the air still trembles with the memory of impact. And I sat at the kitchen table staring at the faint scratches in the wood as if they could anchor me to something familiar. I had barely slept. Replaying the moment Brandon was led off the stage, the shock on the donors' faces, the tight, controlled expression on Anna's as she watched her husband's life collapse in a single sweep of truth, and I wondered whether she would come to me in anger or denial or icy silence. I did not have to wonder long because a little before 9, there was a rapid, urgent knock at my door, and when I opened it, Anna stood there with her hair unbrushed, mascara smudged, and the kind of broken expression that made her look far younger than 28, as though the scaffolding of certainty she had been raised on had finally collapsed. She stepped inside without a word, wrapping her arms around herself as she took in the kitchen with weary eyes. And when she finally spoke, her voice cracked on the first syllable as she said, "I did not know it would go this far." Mom and the rawness in her tone surprised me because it was not accusation or defiance, but something closer to grief. She sank into the chair where she had once dropped the check, so casually pressing her palms to her forehead, and the words spilled out of her in uneven bursts, like someone whose dam had finally broken. She told me she had been groomed since childhood by Jacob to believe that men were better with money, that her father had dismissed every sign of her intelligence by reminding her that one day her husband would handle finances, so she did not need to clutter her mind with complicated numbers, and she said it with the exhaustion of someone who had spent years repeating a story she thought was truth, but was now seeing as manipulation. She confessed that Brandon had asked her to sign documents years ago, papers she did not fully understand, but was told were simple authorizations or routine filings, and she admitted in a voice barely above a whisper that she had helped him move funds between accounts to make the books look cleaner because she thought she was being a supportive wife. She kept saying, "I thought he was just trying to keep Dad's business stable after he died," and the guilt in her face made my chest tighten, even as I fought to keep my expression calm. When she said she knew something was wrong the moment she saw the check being moved, but did not know how to stop Brandon without putting herself at risk, I listened without interrupting, letting her release years of fear and confusion. Then, as though she had been holding it back until she trusted she would not shatter entirely, she looked up at me with eyes full of dread and said, "Mom, there is something else you need to know because it is about you." I felt something inside me brace a familiar tightening in my stomach, and she went still for a moment before continuing in that fragile, trembling voice Dad used, "Your model, Mom, the one you built." And when I did not respond immediately, she pushed on explaining that Jacob had shown Brandon your early spreadsheets years ago, and that Brandon had laughed and said it was ironic that the woman who cannot do money wrote the code that made us rich. The floor seemed to tilt beneath me for a moment, not physically, but in the deep inner sense, where truth reshapes memory. And I heard her words echoing in layers, each one undoing something I thought I knew about the man I married and the daughter I raised. All those years of being treated like I could not understand our finances, all the small humiliations, the reminders to leave the complicated decisions to the grown-ups, the jokes about my confusion with investments, the dismissive pats on the shoulder when I asked questions, all of them blazed suddenly with new meaning because the systems they profited from had been built partly on my work, the same work I had once been proud of until I let their voices convince me it was irrelevant. The shock of it hit first sharp and destabilizing, followed by a throb of pain so deep it felt like betrayal had a physical shape inside my chest, and then strangely, shame washed through me as I wondered how I had not seen it sooner, how I had allowed decades of belittlement to choke out the truth of my own competence. But as Anna kept talking, something inside me shifted again, away from guilt and toward a quiet, fierce reclaiming, because the truth beneath her confession was undeniable. The empire they had built and corrupted had roots in the very software I had designed, while they dismissed me as incapable. Anna kept apologizing, saying she should have realized what Brandon was doing, that she should have told me sooner, that she had pushed him to return the $33 million because she was terrified someone would trace the accounts back to her and to me. And she admitted that the bruises on her wrist were from arguing with him when he insisted they could keep going a little longer as long as I stayed quiet. I listened to everything, and for a moment the room felt too small for the weight of what she had carried, what I had carried, what generations of women had carried under the guise of being cared for financially while being stripped of authority. Then she said the one thing that made the air turn heavy again. Brandon thinks the investigators will look at your involvement because your model created the system they abused. And the moment those words left her mouth, I felt a cold line trace down my spine. If the investigators interpreted my creation of the analytics model as complicity, if they believed I had known how it was being used, everything could pivot sharply in a direction none of us expected. Anna watched my face, searching for anger or blame, and I saw the fear in her expression, the fear that I would abandon her, the way she had abandoned me when she let Brandon decide my worth. But beneath her fear, I also glimpsed something else, something fragile and real. The first honest recognition that the story she had been raised with was a lie, and that she was standing in the ruins of her father's teachings, trying to rebuild herself. I felt the hurt, the shock, the ache of betrayal, but layered over it was a steadiness rising from a place I had forgotten I possessed. And in that moment, I realized that reclaiming credit for my work was not just about exposing them, but about reclaiming myself. The days after Anna's confession passed in a strange suspended blur, the kind where every hour feels stretched thin because the ground beneath your life is shifting and you are trying to keep your balance while memories rearrange themselves into a truth you can no longer look away from. And it was during one of those heavy gray mornings that I received the message that would force a choice I had avoided my entire life. I had just made a pot of coffee, the steam curling like restless questions into the cold kitchen air when my phone buzzed with a number I did not recognize, followed by a voicemail notification, and something in my chest tightened even before I pressed play. The voice that filled the room belonged to a man with the clipped, polished tone of a defense attorney, introducing himself as counsel for Dr. Brandon Lott, and explaining with rehearsed courtesy that his client wished to extend an offer, a path toward resolution that could protect everyone involved. The message continued with a carefully constructed explanation, saying that Brandon respected my position as a grieving widow and loving mother, and that he understood how overwhelming the situation must feel. Then came the part where the mask slipped, and the truth emerged because the attorney said his client was willing to testify that Jacob had been the orchestrator of the financial strategies, that Brandon had merely followed instructions out of loyalty, and that if I could adjust my statement to reflect confusion or misinterpretation regarding Brandon's role, he would in return ensure that Anna was not implicated in the more serious charges. The words hung in the air like smoke, the kind that burns your throat before you register the danger, and I replayed the message twice my heartbeat, loud enough to drown out the quiet hum of the refrigerator. I knew exactly what it was, an attempt to weaponize my lifelong instinct to protect my family, to use my love for Anna as leverage to save the man who had exploited her and tried to erase me from my own life. And yet hearing the offer spoken out loud still made something inside me twist painfully. A mother's instinct to shield her child is not something you unlearn simply because that child grew up flawed or fragile or misguided. And for one awful moment, I imagined Anna standing in a courtroom facing charges she never meant to invite into her life, and the thought made my breath catch. I was still sitting in that silence when Anna arrived, knocking lightly, as though afraid she had already worn out whatever forgiveness I had left, and her eyes were red-rimmed in that unmistakable way that comes from crying for hours. She stepped inside and folded her arms across her chest, then said in a small, uneven voice, "Mom, I know his lawyer contacted you," and I nodded slowly, bracing myself because I could already see where this conversation was heading. She sank into the chair across from me and said, "He is a terrible husband, I know that, and he has ruined everything." "I know that too, but he is still the father of my children, and if he goes away for years, they lose everything, and I do not know how to tell them that their father is gone because of something I helped him with." Her voice trembled on that last part, and I felt the pull of old patterns, the urge to reassure and absorb the burden, so she would not have to the urge to shield her from consequences, even when those consequences were not mine to clean up. She pressed her hands together and said, "If you change your statement, they will not charge me and they will not look deeper and the kids will not suffer." And for a moment I could not speak, because the ache was so familiar, it felt carved into my bones. But then the scene at the gala flashed in my mind the way Brandon looked at me with that thin smirk of victory, seconds before everything fell apart the way he had whispered, that I could relax once I signed the paperwork the way he had believed without doubt that I would hand over every ounce of power I had, simply because he asked, and a quiet steadiness settled over me. I reached across the table and took Anna's hand gently, then said something I had never said to her before. "I cannot save you from the consequences of what he did and what you helped him do." And I thought she might pull away, but she didn't. She just stared at me as tears filled her eyes. Before she could argue, there was another knock at the door, this one firm and professional, and when I opened it, one of the investigators stood on my porch with a look that held both urgency and apology. She stepped inside and asked if we could speak privately, then led me toward the hallway while Anna hovered anxiously by the doorway. The investigator lowered her voice and said, "I need you to know something because it affects your safety and your choices." And then she pulled out a notepad and tapped it lightly, before continuing in a steady, precise tone. "Brandon is framing you in his version. He is saying, you handled the analytics and knew everything he is claiming. You participated. The words struck like a physical blow, not because I believed them, but because I knew how quickly a narrative can twist when the person telling it is desperate enough to survive. I felt the old instinct rise again, the instinct to step forward and take blame, to keep peace, to protect the ones I loved, even at my own expense. But this time, the instinct collided with something stronger, something forged from months of humiliation, fear, and awakening, and for the first time in my life, I said nothing to soften the blow. The investigator continued speaking, explaining that if I altered my statement now, it would raise suspicion, that it could entangle me legally, that Brandon was not asking for mercy, but setting a trap that would shield himself by sacrificing me. And she waited as the truth settled into place. When she left, I returned to the kitchen where Anna stood waiting with her hands clasped, as if praying for a version of me that no longer existed. And I told her slowly and clearly the thing she did not want to hear. I will not lie for him or for you, because that is how the cycle continues, and someone has to end it. Her face crumpled, torn between grief and understanding, and for a moment I thought she might lash out, but instead she nodded with the smallest motion, as though some part of her knew that this was the first step toward breaking free from the men who had shaped her. And as I watched her sit at the table where so much of our pain had begun, I felt something inside me finally settle, a belief forming, with quiet, undeniable certainty that saving myself was not an act of betrayal, but the only path toward justice for all of us. The morning of Brandon's sentencing hearing arrived with a muted gray sky hanging low over Seattle, the kind of sky that feels like it absorbs the sound of everything beneath it. And as I sat on the wooden bench outside the courtroom with my hands folded in my lap, I felt a steadiness settle into me, a steadiness that had taken months to grow, shaped slowly by humiliation, awakening confrontation, and finally a clarity that no longer needed to be loud to be powerful. Inside the courtroom, Anna sat a few rows ahead of me, her shoulders hunched, her hair pulled back in a loose knot that looked as though she had done it on autopilot, and every so often she turned just enough to confirm I was still there, and I would give her a small nod, not as approval or forgiveness, but as presence, because even when choices diverge and truths sting, presence can still exist without surrender. When the judge entered the room, everyone rose, the scrape of chairs echoing off the paneled walls, and Brandon was escorted in by two officers dressed in a suit that no longer fit his frame. The arrogance that once poured off him now pulled tight around him, like a shrinking shell. He did not look toward Anna, and he certainly did not look toward me, though I felt his awareness of my presence like a cold line in the air, taut and vibrating. The prosecutor outlined the charges with clinical precision, each bullet point landing like a hammer on stone, detailing fraudulent billing schemes, false documentation, manipulated vendor contracts, and the use of patient information for unauthorized claims. And with each example, the courtroom seemed to lean closer, as though even the walls needed to hear the truth spoken plainly. Brandon's attorney tried to counter with a narrative about loyalty to Jacob's business, about confusion and misplaced trust, but the judge cut through the performance with a measured firmness that left no room for theatrics, stating that the evidence showed a deliberate, sustained pattern of exploitation, rather than a momentary lapse in judgment. When the sentence was announced, 14 to 18 years in federal custody, with no eligibility for early release, until a significant portion had been served, a tremor of reaction rippled through the room, and Anna let out a small sound. Not a cry exactly, but the quiet exhale of a life shifting beneath her feet. Brandon remained still. His jaw clenched, his gaze fixed on the table in front of him. And for a moment, I wondered if he grasped the full weight of what had unraveled, or if he still believed himself the victim of someone else's intelligence. As he was led away, I felt neither triumph nor pity, but something more complex, a recognition that justice, when it finally arrives, is less like a firework and more like a recalibration, a slow redrawing of the lines that had been warped for too long. Outside the courthouse, Anna approached me with tear-filled eyes, her mouth trembling as she struggled to form words. But before she could speak, I gently raised my hand and said softly, "My daughter will not learn that a man can commit crimes, and her mother will clean it up." And the words seemed to settle into her with a heavy truth, one she did not fight, one she finally accepted even through the ache of it. In the weeks that followed, the consequences expanded outward, touching every part of the world. Brandon had built the clinic, losing contracts, the supplier network collapsing under investigation fines levied so steeply they made headlines, and Anna moving in with a friend, while she figured out her next steps, her old life dissolving piece by piece, until all that remained was the raw beginning of something unprotected but honest. I spent those weeks answering questions from investigators, signing stacks of documents, sorting through decades of financial records, and each task, though draining, felt like a necessary purging of shadows. Then one Monday morning, I received a call that startled me enough to make me sit down before returning the greeting, because the voice belonged to the director of the compliance division at the very corporation that had acquired Ward Analytics years ago. She explained that my involvement in uncovering the fraud, combined with my original contributions to the analytical model, had prompted internal discussions, and she asked if I would consider taking a consulting role, supporting investigations, and helping refine the system I had once designed under a name I had nearly forgotten. When she mentioned the compensation, a 6-figure salary with full autonomy, and the possibility of remote work, I felt something inside me soften, not with pride, but with a deep, overdue validation. She added that the company intended to officially credit me as a co-creator of the model in their forthcoming public report, a recognition that rewrote years of erasure in a single sentence. Around the same time, the legal team handling the aftermath of Jacob's estate finalized the resolution around the $33 million, confirming that a significant portion could be legally retained after restitution and penalties were deducted, cleaned through formal channels, and acknowledged as separate from the corrupt streams Brandon and Everpoint had manipulated. Hearing that news stirred strange emotions in me, because money had always been the battlefield where my dignity was stripped away, yet now it also represented the independence I had been denied for decades, not through violence, but through slow, persistent belittling. As weeks turned into a new season, I found myself returning to the truth that justice is not free, that every person pays a different price. Brandon paid with his freedom. Anna paid with the destruction of the life she thought she understood, and I paid with the shattering of illusions I had held for far too long. Illusions about my marriage, about my daughter's strength, about the nature of competence and worth inside a family where roles had been carved too rigidly. But losing those illusions felt strangely like gaining breath, like standing in a clearing after years of dense fog, and realizing the path ahead is open even if the ground behind you is still smoldering. When I accepted the consulting position and received the formal recognition as co-author of the model, I felt not triumph, but reclamation, as though the parts of me I had buried to keep the peace had at last been excavated and returned to my own hands. It was not the life I expected, nor the justice I imagined, but it was mine in a way nothing had ever been before. And for the first time since Jacob's death, I felt myself stepping forward, not as a widow or a mother or a victim, but as a woman who had finally learned the price of protecting everyone except herself and decided she would not pay it anymore. 1 year later, I woke up to the quiet hum of the tide brushing against the rocks below my small house in Gig Harbor, the kind of quiet that does not simply fill a space, but steadies it. And as I stood barefoot in my kitchen with a mug of coffee warming my hands, I realized how profoundly different my mornings had become, no longer shaped by anxiety or the constant second-guessing that once lived under my skin like a permanent shadow, but shaped instead by a sense of ownership, both of the house, whose deed was finally in my name alone, and of the life that felt like it had finally begun at 56. The kitchen was renovated with soft white cabinets and a new stone counter that reflected the late morning sun. Yet in the center of the room stood the same chipped wooden table Anna had slid. The $33 million check across the same table Jacob used to dismiss me at the same table where I once washed dishes late at night while everyone else slept, and I kept it not because I needed the furniture, but because it reminded me how far I had traveled from that version of myself who believed silence was survival. Some days I would sit at that table and watch the boats glide through the harbor while sorting through paperwork for the Hayes Ward Foundation, the nonprofit I started 6 months earlier, with the help of a small team of women who had survived their own versions of financial control and domestic manipulation. And our mission was simple yet deeply necessary to educate and support women caught in the quiet traps of economic abuse. Women who were told they were too emotional to handle money, or too naive to understand documents, or too clumsy to manage accounts. Women who were convinced their dependence was their fault rather than the result of someone else's deliberate control. The foundation had grown faster than I expected, with donors reaching out from across Washington and Oregon, and each story they shared felt like a thread weaving into a tapestry I wished I had belonged to years ago, one where women did not have to wait for catastrophe to reclaim their autonomy. Anna visited on Sundays, always around mid-afternoon, never with the bright confidence she once wore like armor, but with a quieter presence that felt closer to truth, and she would bring pastries from the bakery near her apartment, then sit across from me at the wooden table folding and unfolding the edge of the napkin while she talked about therapy, about rebuilding her routines, about learning how to tell her own voice, apart from Brandon's ghostly influence lingering in her thoughts. There was still distance between us, not hostility, but the kind of distance formed when two people have to relearn each other from the beginning, and I did not rush the process because healing, I had learned, stretches and contracts on its own timeline, refusing to be hurried. Sometimes Anna would ask how the foundation was doing, and I would tell her small updates, careful not to overwhelm her, because although we were moving toward honesty, there were still parts of my new life I held close, not out of spite, but out of reverence for the independence I had earned. On one of those Sundays, she asked whether I ever regretted not saving Brandon from the consequences he now faced, and I answered her as gently as I could that regret and responsibility were not the same, that I could grieve what she lost without erasing what he did, and she nodded, slowly absorbing the words rather than rushing to respond, which in itself was a kind of growth. She told me she had started volunteering at a community center, helping women prepare job applications, and that it made her feel useful in a way she had never experienced. And for the first time since the Gala arrest, I saw a glimmer of something new in her. Not the brittle confidence she once performed, but a grounded humility that allowed real strength to grow. What I did not tell her, because it was not yet the right time, was that the corporation that had purchased Ward Analytics continued to send me dividend checks, every quarter checks that now reach 7 figures annually, because of the restructuring they had implemented and the expansion of the analytics division built on the model I had quietly authored years ago. And although I used part of the income to support the foundation, I kept the majority tucked away in investments under my own name, secured by advisors who understood the importance of autonomy. I did not hide the truth to deceive her, but to protect the fragile balance we were rebuilding, because Anna needed to learn that my power did not come from sudden wealth, but from choosing myself after decades of not doing so, and revealing the financial scale too soon could distort that understanding. Some evenings, when the sun dipped low and painted the harbor in warm gold, I would step outside with a sweater draped around my shoulders and listen to the water lapping softly, thinking about how inheritance works in ways people rarely discuss, because what I inherited from the collapse of my marriage and the expose of Brandon's crimes was not just money or recognition, but the freedom to define myself without apology, to choose peace, without shrinking to say no, without fear of being abandoned. I learned that inheriting does not always mean receiving something from someone else. Sometimes it means reclaiming something that was yours all along, but hidden beneath years of dismissal and minimization. And as I watched the lights of the boats flicker across the darkening water, I felt the truth settle into me with a quiet solidity. People in town occasionally recognized me from the news coverage surrounding the Gala arrest and the subsequent trial, and sometimes they would stop to tell me that my testimony had inspired someone they knew to speak up about financial abuse, and I always thanked them with a modest smile, never mentioning the dividends or the consulting offers or the influence I now carried in the regulatory world of healthcare analytics, because quiet power, I had learned, travels farther than noise. And when I sat at that chipped table one evening, tracing the worn edge with my fingertip, I whispered to myself, let them think I got lucky with a settlement. The truth is, I built the system they tried to abuse, and then I helped take it back. And saying it out loud did not feel like arrogance, but like a completion. The closing of a circle drawn over years of strain and awakening and reclamation. If you have ever been underestimated until it saved you, tell me your story in the comments. Your voice matters more than you know.